Imagine the scene. A man tries to break into a house in suburban Miami, believing that the residents are traveling and that there would be an easy place for a robbery. He approaches with the intention of forcing the back door, thinking that no one will notice his action. But what he did not imagine was that by knocking over an old toolbox, an unexpected and totally unusual danger would reveal itself. Inside that box, there was an active nest of tropical marimbondos, who quickly realized the threat and decided to act. And what happened next was worthy of a thriller, entitled to a mixture of humor and horror that left the whole neighborhood open-mouthed. Have you ever experienced a situation where something simple turns into something completely out of the ordinary? Stay with me until the end, because this story has details that will surprise you and show that sometimes nature has a very peculiar way of protecting what is yours. What makes this narrative even more intriguing is the invader's reaction to being surrounded by the marimbondos. In a matter of seconds, he was attacked by a barrage of angry insects, which made a point of defending their home with an almost frightening intensity. And as the scene unfolded, neighbors who witnessed it all gasped, some even laughing at the situation, others frightened by the speed and violence of the attack. It is difficult to imagine that an attempted robbery could end like this, with the criminal having to desperately flee, surrounded by a real army of tropical marimbondos. Have you ever thought about the force that nature can exert in the protection of a space, or in the surprise that a simple old toolbox can hide? We often believe that breaking into a house depends only on human action, but this story shows that sometimes the real guardians are hidden in the simplest and most unexpected details. And what happened to this invader is proof that even in the calm of a quiet suburb, insects can turn into the most unlikely heroes. Stay with me until the next chapter, because the story doesn't end here. You will discover how the police entered the scene, the deplorable state of the attacker, and the reactions of the community that, until then, had only seen a quiet routine being interrupted by an episode that became a reason for laughter and reflection. Get ready, because what comes next is even more surprising and reveals that in life, sometimes the greatest protection comes from where we least expect it. If you found this story as unbelievable as we did, leave here in the comments what touched you the most, or if you have ever been in an unusual situation that seemed like something out of a movie. Your opinion is very important, because it helps to create a community where we can exchange experiences, laugh together at the craziest situations, and learn from all this. Also, if you liked the video, don't forget to like it, because it shows the algorithm that content like this is relevant and encourages us to bring more stories that mix suspense, humor, and life lessons. Another thing that helps a lot is subscribing to the channel. Thus you stay on top of everything we post, always with different stories, but that have in common the fact that they make us reflect and have a good laugh. Your support makes all the difference, because it is he who makes it possible to continue this type of content, which seeks to spread positive messages, intelligent humor, and that dose of surprise that everyone loves. Your participation here is what makes this channel grow and reach more people who, just like you, like stories that show that even in the most unexpected situations, nature and life have a unique way of surprising us. So stay with me, that there is still much more to come, and I am sure you will enjoy what comes next. It was a warm and quiet afternoon in Miami, that kind of day that seems to invite you to a quiet rest, where the light wind sways the leaves and the feeling of calm seems to envelop the entire neighborhood. The houses were well kept, with well-kept gardens, clean fences, and the colors of the facades reflecting the bright summer sun. The residents, in their daily routine, were busy with simple tasks. Some people taking care of the plants, others resting in the shade, while children played in the street, making the atmosphere even more peaceful. In this tranquil setting, it seemed that nothing extraordinary could happen there. Everything seemed to be in harmony, a kind of perfect picture of a community that knows each other, trusts and lives its days without great worries. Neighbors exchanged greetings as they passed each other, and the sense of security seemed to be permeated in the air, as if it were one of the unwritten laws of that neighborhood. However, this sense of peace and stability has a side that few realize at the time. The daily routine, as peaceful as it may seem, can hide vulnerabilities, especially when someone's absence creates an opportunity for those who have their eye on something that is not their own. And it was precisely this vulnerability that caught the attention of a criminal, who decided that that silent afternoon would be his chance to act. The house, located on a street that looked like an illustration from a postcard, was empty, as the family had traveled for a walk or perhaps a visit, leaving everything as usual. For the invader, that was the perfect setting for a quick hit without too many complications. He believed that with the house unoccupied, he could enter, take some valuables, and leave unnoticed. He approached calmly, thinking that his action would be quick, a silent invasion that would not attract attention. But what he didn't know was that, in the routine of those seemingly ordinary homes, there might be details that escape the hasty eye. Something that day, proved decisive. An old toolbox, forgotten in the yard, which had a surprise stored inside. When trying to force the back door, that man knocked over the box, which fell with a loud noise, and it was at this moment that the story completely changed. It was not a simple toolbox that fell, but rather an active nest of tropical marimbondos who, upon realizing the threat, decided to defend themselves with surprising ferocity. The scenario until then of tranquility turned into a real horror movie scene, where the unexpected revealed itself brutally and quickly. The marimbondos, who normally go unnoticed in the daily routine, were there, hiding in the shadow of a forgotten box, ready to protect their space. As soon as the invader touched that nest, a barrage of angry insects came out towards his face, body, and hands, forming a cloud of attack that made him run, desperate, through the garden. The scene was as fast-paced as it was surreal, and neighbors who witnessed it all gasped at the intensity of the attack. The man who initially thought he would have an easy time soon realized that he had got into a real battle against a force of nature that, at that moment, proved to be ruthless. In this scenario of apparent security, the vulnerability of that house was exposed by a detail that seemed insignificant, but which in practice turned out to be a real weapon of protection. The marimbondos, which for many were just ordinary insects, showed that nature often has its own defense mechanisms that can surprise even the most audacious invaders. And as the invader fled, surrounded by a swarm of angry marimbondos, the scene became a kind of silent lesson in how the vulnerability of an environment can be transformed into a natural fortress, capable of creating profound impacts even on the mentality of those who try to challenge what is protected by these invisible but extremely effective guardians. When reflecting on all this, it is possible to realize that many times the security of a house is not only in the cameras, alarms, or high fences, but also in the connection with nature and in the understanding that each element of the environment has its own history and its role in protecting what is yours. This experience, which seemed to be a simple attempt at theft, ended up becoming a real lesson in respect for the impact that the unknown can have on our decisions and actions. Behind the scenes of this episode reveals that in the journey of understanding the world around us, one must be attentive to the simplest details, as they can hide hidden truths capable of completely transforming our perception of safety and security. And as that story spread through the neighborhood, the conversations took on new tones, mixing nervous laughter and reflections on how nature often does justice in a way no one expects. After all, nothing that afternoon seemed to indicate that an invader was going to run out of there, surrounded by an army of tropical marimbondos, who became the real protagonists of that episode. And it is precisely this impact, this transformation of an ordinary situation into something extraordinary, that makes us think about the decisions we make and the invisible behind the scenes that often work silently to protect what we value most. He writes there, "Nature is our greatest ally in protecting the home." With cautious steps, the man approached from the back of the house, believing that there he would have an easy opportunity to commit his act. His confidence was such that he probably already visualized what was going to happen: break down the door, pick up some valuables, and disappear before anyone noticed. For him, this was a quick, almost automatic action, a routine of those who had already done it several times, or at least believed that it was so. With an iron bar in his hands, he began to force in an attempt to open the small wooden door that gave access to the interior of the residence. The sound of metal slamming against wood echoed silently in the garden, while his movements were firm and determined, like someone who had done it before, or at least trusted his luck that nothing would go wrong. In his head, the plan was simple. He believed that by breaking down that door, he would be able to enter without making a sound, take whatever was of most value, and quickly leave before anyone noticed. Perhaps he even had an image of success in his mind, a sense of easy achievement without major obstacles. But at the same time, such excessive confidence created an illusion of invulnerability, a certainty that nothing could go wrong, that the house would be empty, or that the residents would not return in time. And it was this false sense of security that led him to underestimate what could happen there at that moment, exactly in those seconds when his hand pushed the iron against the door. As he applied force to the iron bar, his head was focused on the idea that he would soon be inside, at the heart of what he believed to be a risk-free opportunity. His mind was already visualizing the objects he could take, the feeling of victory at being able to open that door, and the relief that everything had been precisely planned. He thought that there was nothing that could hinder his plans, that everything was under control, as if the most important details were just a formality. His posture was that of someone who believed he was in charge, who dominated the situation, without realizing that there in the shadow of that silent garden, an invisible force was preparing to make its entrance on the scene. But what he didn't know, or perhaps didn't want to believe, was that the universe often has its own ways of balancing things, that what seems simple and guaranteed can turn into a real chaos from one moment to the next. And in that instant, as his hands began to press on the door, a surprise he never imagined was about to happen. The details he ignored, the forgotten toolbox, the nest of marimbondos hidden in the shadows, were about to completely change the course of that story. His confidence, which until then had seemed unshakable, was beginning to unravel in the face of a simple but powerful truth hidden in the routine of nature. In the sweltering heat of that day, the invader's every move seemed fraught with a false sense of security. The force he applied to the iron bar was the result of a hope that, with a little effort, everything would be resolved quickly. But what he didn't realize was that in that instant, a simple act of force, an attempted break-in, would trigger a completely unexpected reaction. Pushing the door with all the intensity, his body leaned forward and involuntarily bumped into an old toolbox forgotten in the corner of the yard. The impact was loud, a rumbling sound that echoed throughout the area, breaking the afternoon silence with a sudden aggressive noise. The box fell hard to the ground, scattering rusty tools, nails, keys, and pieces of wood around. But what really caught her attention was what was hidden inside her, something the intruder never imagined finding there. As soon as the box opened, a cloud of angry insects rushed towards him at an impressive speed. It was an active nest of tropical marimbondos, which were there silent and hidden, waiting for the opportunity to protect themselves. Those insects, which seemed so fragile at first glance, had a defense force that would reveal itself in a frightening way. The impact of the box on the ground was enough to awaken a real avalanche of marimbondos, which swarmed out, with an attack speed that left the invader completely paralyzed. The first thing he felt was a burning pain and a burning sensation, as if 1,000 pricks of needles were piercing his skin. His eyes widened in surprise and fear as he realized that this attack was not a joke, but a quick and fierce response from a community of insects that defended their space with an almost irrational intensity. At that moment, what seemed like a simple robbery attempt turned into a desperate race, with the invader trying to escape from the swarm of marimbondos that surrounded him on all sides. That scene, which looked like something out of a horror movie, turned into a kind of spectacle of emotional impact. The man, in an attempt to escape, began to run around the back of the garden, his face and arms covered with angry insects. Each step felt like a survival effort, a struggle against an invisible force that manifested itself in a brutal way. The marimbondos, who were previously hidden, showed their true strength when it came to protecting the hive. Their stingers, which can be lethal to those who invade their territory, made the invader feel on the skin the impact of a natural defense that he completely underestimated. At that moment, all his confidence turned to panic, as he desperately tried to get away from that invisible enemy who had become a real threat. The feeling of pain, the feeling of being surrounded by a cloud of angry insects, all that was enough for him to lose control. He had no idea that a simple toolbox could conceal such a great danger, an impact that would change his perception of vulnerability and how unforgiving nature can be when it feels threatened. For him, it was all a lesson that, almost without realizing it, he would have to learn the hard way, that the impact of a natural reaction can be devastating, and that sometimes what seems insignificant, like a forgotten box, can hide a hidden truth that changes everything. And so as he fled, surrounded by the marimbondos who insisted on attacking him without mercy, that episode became a story that the neighborhood interpreted as a real drama of impact. A lesson that, in the journey of decisions and actions, one must be attentive to the simplest details since they can hide revelations that change the course of everything. Life force in its purest form often reveals itself in the most unexpected moments, revealing that true protection can be hidden in the simplest and seemingly insignificant places. And in the end, what was left was the reminder that, in the great gear of natural impact, even the smallest detail has its role in the story that unfolds before our eyes. The next instant was pure confusion, an explosion of chaos that seemed to spread through the garden like a sudden storm. Within seconds, the silence of the afternoon was broken by the furious hum of the marimbondos that came out en masse from the nest, forming a threatening cloud that moved with impressive speed towards the invader. The man who until then had hoped that his audacity would be enough to conquer that invasion now found himself completely surrounded by a mass of insects that spared no effort to defend them. The sound of the swarm was deafening, a mixture of high-pitched buzzing, popping, and the flapping of wings that seemed to fill all the space around, creating an atmosphere of pure sensory impact. Insects in a coordinated attack spread en masse, plunging into the invader's body with ferocity. Each sting was a cutting pain, an intense burning that spread to his arms, face, and neck, leaving visible marks on his skin. The cry of pain and surprise involuntarily escaped from his mouth, mixing with the sound of the swarm that seemed more and more furious. The force of the attack was such that in the confusion he dropped the tool with an awkward force, as if he had been hit by a charge of adrenaline or panic. His movements became uncoordinated, a desperate attempt to get away from that mass of insects that surrounded him on all sides, like an immense wall of natural attack. The scene turned into a real race for survival. The invader, his face dark with sweat and his skin already reddened and full of stinging dots, began to run aimlessly through the garden. His steps were clumsy and hurried, trying to escape from that army of marimbondos who insisted on reaching every exposed point of his body. His head spun in pain, fear and confusion, as he desperately tried to shake off that attack that seemed to have no end. The screams of pain echoed through the environment, mixing with the incessant buzzing of insects, creating an atmosphere of almost madness, of an epic battle between man and the force of nature. At the same time, the neighbors who watched everything from afar were stunned by the scene. That moment of chaos turned into a kind of spectacle of emotional impact, where the unexpected took over everything. Some were frightened, others trying to understand what exactly had happened there, while others, more observant, realized how quickly the situation had become a real battle of resistance. That man, who had entered there with the idea of robbing a house apparently unnoticed, now found himself completely vulnerable in the face of a force that he had no way to foresee or control. Nature, at that moment, showed a face that few know in its purest, wildest, and at the same time truest essence. The feeling of helplessness was the hallmark of that moment. The invader tried to rise, tried to turn around, tried to run away, but the marimbondos did not give a truce. Each sting was a reminder that often the force majeure is hidden in the simplest details, in the invisible backstage that we often ignore in the routine of everyday life. That unexpected attack was a real lesson in impact, a demonstration that natural chaos can manifest in such unpredictable and devastating ways that even the most prepared of humans can find themselves at the mercy of an invisible but extremely powerful force. Thus, what seemed like a trivial invasion turned into a battle of survival, a revelation that in the journey of our decisions, the true revelations are often hidden in the most singular details, ready to transform everything from one hour to the next. The scene that unfolded before the eyes of the neighbors was something that looked like something out of an action movie, but in fact it was the harsh reality of that moment of impact. The desperate screams of the invader, mixed with the deafening hum of the marimbondos, echoed throughout the street, causing the people who were nearby to immediately mobilize. Some, frightened, ran in the direction of the noise, while others tried to understand what had happened. The sight that turned out was so surreal that many had to rub their eyes to believe what they were seeing. A man, his face red with pain and fear, ran desperately through the garden, surrounded by a cloud of angry insects that gave no respite while trying to get rid of the unsuccessful attacks. The people standing nearby froze for a moment, unable to understand if this was a movie scene or a real situation. At first, it seemed that everyone was watching a spectacle of destruction, an explosion of chaos that seemed impossible to contain. Some tried to help, shouting instructions or drawing the attention of someone closer, but most stood there gaping, not sure how to react to such an unusual scene. In that instant, the street seemed to have been taken over by an invisible force that turned a simple act of attempted robbery into a battle of survival. The closest witnesses reported that when they heard the screams of pain and the incessant buzzing, they felt a shiver down their spine. It was as if the whole routine of an ordinary morning had been interrupted by a natural force that was not seen every day. Some people said it looked like a horror movie scene, mixed with a dose of unintentional comedy. In the face of a situation as unexpected as it was hilarious, if not tragic for those who were in the middle of the confusion. Many still remember how the invader looked completely disoriented, trying to run away from an invisible enemy who turned out to be ruthless. Close neighbors reported that seeing the man run almost uncontrollably, with his face and arms covered with stings, many felt a mixture of fear and a twinge of disbelief. How could something as natural as a swarm of marimbondos cause such destruction? For them, it was a lesson in how vulnerability can transform in ways no one expects. One wrong decision, one overlooked detail, and it can all turn into a true revelation of impact. That episode ended up becoming a kind of story that everyone commented on afterwards, as a landmark episode in the routine of that community. Some people even joked that the scene felt like one of those transformative moments that life brings, where what seemed like something ordinary turns out to be a powerful force that no one can control. The reports told how the invader, in that desperate escape, looked like a character from an unusual story, surrounded by an army of insects that suddenly took on the role of true guardians of that house. And as he disappeared into the distance, his face scarred and filled with fear, the street fell silent for a brief period, leaving everyone with a sense that they had witnessed something that would forever change their perception of safety and natural protection. Today, when recalling that scene, many still comment on the force of nature that suddenly showed its truest, wildest impact, and how it served to reveal the invisible behind the scenes of a protection that often goes unnoticed. The strongest lesson remained in the memory. In a journey of decisions, the impact of one detail can transform the whole story. And in those streets, the hidden truth of the marimbondos was revealed in the form of a natural defense, which left a mark in the memory of each one who witnessed that moment of chaos and impact. The neighbors, frightened by the noise and confusion that spread through the garden, did not hesitate to call the police immediately. The speed of communication was crucial, because at that moment everything happened so quickly that any delay could turn the situation into something even more dangerous. By the time security officers moved in, the scene had become almost surreal. The attacker, completely covered in stings, had thrown himself to the ground, unable to move or flee. His eyes were wide, his skin red and swollen because of the voracious attack of the marimbondos, who, still flying around, seemed to watch over their territory with impressive determination. When the police arrived, it did not take much effort for the capture to be made. The invader, in a deplorable state, did not even have the strength to react. His breathing was panting, and every movement felt like a monumental effort. Officers quickly restrained him, taking care to avoid further stinging and to ensure he did not injure himself further. The scene was one of concrete justice, a kind of closure of a cycle that began with an imprudent decision and ended in the inevitable consequence. It was no longer a question of suspicion or of attempted invasion, but rather of the fulfillment of a punishment that seemed just in the face of the entire sequence of events that had taken place. What might seem like a simple theft attempt has turned into an impactful lesson that life usually teaches in its most direct, blunt form. When placing the attacker in the vehicle, the officers exchanged looks of disbelief and at the same time relief. The scene showed that even in a seemingly peaceful routine, the impact of a wrong decision can lead to severe consequences. The force of nature there represented by the marimbondos had proved implacable, and their defense had been sufficient to prevent the criminal from proceeding with his action. It was as if the entire community had watched a kind of natural justice manifest, a hidden truth we often overlook. Life has its own protective mechanisms, and they can reveal themselves in ways no one expects. The arrest was completed surprisingly easily, almost with a sense of collective relief, as if justice itself were there, in those agents, to ensure that the impact of that man's decision was definitively realized. Relief was felt by all who were there because, even in its simplicity, that scene represented the strength of order and of what is just. That episode, which began with a risky action, ended with a clear consequence, showing that in the journey of decisions we make, the repercussions can be faster and more forceful than we imagined. While the police officers conducted the intruder, residents and neighbors continued to watch, still impressed by the scene. Many commented on how quickly it all happened, remembering how a simple toolbox and a seemingly banal decision could trigger such a powerful reaction. It was proof that the impact of our actions, however small it may seem, often has effects that reverberate far beyond what we can imagine. And as the man was led away by the policeman, a sense of justice was reaffirmed in those hearts, reinforcing that sometimes the universe conspires in favor of the natural order, making it clear that, in the great journey of life, each decision has its own consequences, many of them more impactful than we can predict. When the mistress of the house returned from the trip, still with a tired face from a week away, she never imagined that, when she opened the door, she would find a scene so unusual and full of irony that it seemed out of a tale of black humor. She, who had always valued the safety of her home and relied on the quiet of suburbia, had a surprise that would change her perception of protection and vulnerability in an almost comical way. Upon crossing the threshold, his first reaction was one of amazement when he noticed the amount of insects clustered around the door, forming a kind of curtain of marimbondos that seemed to be there, silent and vigilant, awaiting the return of their true guardians. And at that moment she understood, with a mixture of laughter and disbelief, that the real heroes of that story were not the alarms, cameras, or high walls, but rather these small insects that suddenly took on the role of unusual protectors. The story soon spread to the neighbors, who began to exchange looks of surprise and amusement at the same time. Some, with a singing smile, joked that that house had an army of marimbondos at its disposal, a kind of natural protection that no one could imagine. Others commented that it looked like a comedy scene, one of those episodes that life takes us by surprise, where fate plays ironically with our expectations. The narrative gained strength and even became a kind of local nickname, an affectionate way of calling the residents the house protected by the marimbondos. It was a pun that mixed fear, respect, and a hint of humor, making it clear that even in apparent vulnerability, nature had shown its strength in a way that no one could have predicted. The owner, listening to the jokes and recognition of the story, could not hide a mixture of pride and humor. She has always believed that the security of a home goes beyond electrified fences or expensive alarms. That episode showed her that sometimes the impact of a simple natural reaction can be more efficient than any cutting-edge technology. And even with all the impact, she did not fail to reflect on the true essence of protection. Perhaps on the journey of understanding our limits and vulnerabilities, we need to learn to also value the invisible forces that can be at our side, often hidden in the simplest details, such as a nest of marimbondos that from one hour to another became a symbol of resistance and protection. What that story failed to teach in a clearer way is that fate, with its pinch of irony, often teaches us that true security comes not only from what we can see or control, but also from what nature offers us spontaneously and often unexpectedly. That episode became a symbol of a transformation in the perception of security, a lesson that sometimes the greatest guardians of a home can be hidden in the most singular details, in the invisible backstage of a story that seemed to be already written. The community in general began to see that residence with different eyes, no longer as a vulnerable space but as a symbol of natural protection, where the impact of an unexpected reaction was stronger than any high wall or surveillance system. And as the story spread, many reflected on the revelations it brought. Life, for all its unpredictability, has a way of turning what seems fragile into a fortress of resistance. The irony of all this is that often the true heroes of an impact story are right where we least expect them, hidden in the simplest of details, ready to surprise and transform our understanding of safety and security. Thus, the fame of that house as the one protected by the marimbondos only reinforces the idea that in the journey of learning to trust, the truest impact often comes from a hidden rack, a hidden truth that life reveals at the right time, with all its strength and humor. This story is a powerful illustration of how the impact of a decision, however small it may seem, can trigger a chain reaction that reveals a hidden truth often hidden behind the scenes of our routine. When we think about home security, we often believe that it depends only on external features such as alarms, cameras, or reinforced fences. But in practice, we often forget that true protection comes from elements that are beyond human control, that are part of a natural system that works independently of our will. The marimbondos, in this case, illustrated just that. A force that, when triggered, reacts in a ruthless way, transforming vulnerability into an invisible fortress that no one can ignore. This is a lesson that throughout our journey, the transformation of obstacles into allies can lie in understanding behind the scenes, in revealing that the true protective forces are often hidden in the simplest details, but that they carry enormous natural strength. As we reflect on this story, we realize that it also reveals a lot about our mentality in the face of difficulties. We often face challenges and obstacles with a posture of helplessness, believing that the solution is always in something external or in an intervention that depends on third parties. But the essence of transformation lies in realizing that often the answer lies within us, or in understanding that the impact of our actions can trigger profound changes, even in the force of nature around us. This story shows us that the impact of a small decision, such as trying to break into a house, can open doors to revelations that go beyond the obvious, helping to strengthen our ability to realize that true security lies in our connection with the environment, in our sensitivity to detail, and in the courage to understand that behind every reaction there is a hidden truth that can transform everything. This understanding leads us to a greater reflection on the power of our mindset and the decisions we make throughout life. Every choice we make, every attitude, is a critical building block in building the impact we leave on the world. When we learn to value the details, to understand the workings behind the scenes, we are able to turn obstacles into opportunities for growth. And this story, with all its symbolic force, shows that justice often comes not only from the official system, but also from the natural impact of the forces that, when triggered, assert their truth. It is a lesson that invites us to think beyond the immediate, to realize that everything is connected, and that sometimes the greatest revelation of impact happens precisely where we least expect it, in the simplest details that escape our superficial vision. That's why it's important to keep an open mind for the learning opportunities that arise in the most difficult times. Often, what seems to be a simple threat or vulnerability can turn into the greatest source of strength and protection when we can understand the impact of our actions and the invisible force that acts behind the scenes. This story teaches us that the universe has its own ways of acting, that the impact of a decision can trigger a real transformation, and that along the way, the most valuable revelations are hidden in the most singular details. Thus, by reflecting on all this, we can inspire ourselves to develop a more open mindset, more sensitive to the invisible forces that surround us, and more prepared to see beyond the obvious, since it is precisely in these backstage that the greatest truths are often hidden. Now I want to go even deeper into this subject, so that we can understand how this lesson can transform the way we face daily challenges. When we look at the impact that a simple natural reaction has had on that story, we realize that it also reveals a universal truth, that true transformation only happens when we are attentive to the details that we often ignore. Every decision, every attitude, has the potential to trigger a chain of impact that in the end reveals a new perspective, a new way of seeing the world and ourselves. This story teaches us that behind every reaction, there is a hidden truth that can help us strengthen our mentality, to understand that behind the scenes often carry the most powerful force of all. And by developing this sensitivity, we are better prepared to deal with the unforeseen, to turn obstacles into opportunities, and to realize that the impact of our actions goes far beyond what we can imagine. After all, the journey of transformation begins precisely in our ability to perceive these details, to understand that the universe works in a subtle but extremely efficient way to show us that everything is interconnected, that each reaction has a consequence, and that often the secret of success lies in seeing beyond what the eyes can capture. If you have made it this far, I want to thank you for being with me until the end of this story that deep down, reminds us of how the impact of our actions can be greater than we imagine. Perhaps this story has made you reflect on the invisible details that can make all the difference in your life and your safety. If this content brought some insight, or made you think a little more about the strength that nature and small actions have, here is my invitation for you to subscribe to the channel. Thus, you follow more stories that show how the world is full of surprises and valuable teachings, always with a light approach, and that makes us think. Also leave a comment saying that I'm with you until the end, or something that shows that you have followed all the reflection so far. Your participation is very important because it helps strengthen this exchange of ideas and encourages us to continue bringing content that makes a difference. And of course, if you liked what you heard, give it a like in a natural way. It's a way of showing that this kind of story makes sense to you and that we are on the right track. There is a video here on the side that complements this subject. Click and continue with me there. Thus we continue to learn and reflect together, always with lightness and a true connection. Thank you for being a part of this journey, and until the next content,